It begins with a puzzle that has been whispered for centuries. How does a city become a synonym for sin, even after its stones have fallen silent? How can a place that barely rises from the desert dust still burn in the collective imagination as a furnace of desire and punishment? As you let your body grow heavier on the bed, as your breathing slows, that question hovers over the ruins of Babylon like a thin, sleepless mist. So before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I'm doing here. And if you feel like sharing, murmur your location and your local time into the comments, like a small light in the distance, another watchful soul awake under a different sky. The name Babylon is older than almost any living language, yet it still tastes of danger and fascination when it is spoken. It slips through religious texts, classical histories, occult treatises, political speeches. It is the whore, the great city, the place of confusion and fall. Yet if the listener were to stand today on the archaeological site in modern Iraq, there would be no towering walls of blazing blue, no vast ziggurats scraping the sky, no roaring marketplace of forbidden luxuries. Mostly there is dust, low mounds, reconstructed fragments, and the quiet tapping of archaeologists' tools. Is it not strange that the most famous city of sins has left behind so little that feels sinful or even alive? Ancient writers did not see it this way. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE, described Babylon as a gigantic metropolis, with walls so wide that chariots could race on top, with streets crossing at right angles, with astonishing temples and towers. Later, biblical texts painted a different kind of picture, one of arrogance toward heaven, of exiles weeping by foreign rivers, of divine wrath gathering above palaces of gold. Between the measured fascination of a traveller and the moral fury of a prophet, a city was split into two shadows. Which one was real? Or did both accounts, each in their own way, already begin to bury the living city under words? Archaeology arrived late to the scene, like a careful stranger stepping into the wreckage of a scandal that everyone thinks they already understand. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, German excavations under Robert Koldewey uncovered the Ishtar Gate, processional ways, palace foundations, and countless bricks stamped with the name of Nebuchadnezzar II. The glazed blue bricks of the gate, with their luminous lions and dragons, were painstakingly removed and reassembled in Berlin. Visitors now stand in a European museum, gazing up at that gate, feeling a thrill of the exotic, the forbidden, the legendary. Yet the gate itself is covered in royal inscriptions that speak more of piety and restoration than of vice. If a city's sins are so heavy, why do its own bricks speak mostly of devotion, order, and cosmic harmony? The listener might wonder whether the sins of Babylon were built from actions or from narratives. There is no doubt that the empire could be brutal. Deportations, military campaigns, strict laws, hierarchies carved almost into stone. Yet was it more vicious than Assyria before it, or Persia after it, or Rome, or any other superpower patrolling the borders of its own fear? The Bible chose Babylon as its central symbol of captivity and arrogance. Yet historical evidence shows that exiles there could own property, conduct business, and sometimes rise in society. Some Jewish communities remained in Babylon for centuries, even after they were allowed to return. Is it not peculiar that some chose to stay in the supposed city of corruption? Beneath the sands, baked clay tablets whisper a different register of memory. Cuneiform records from Babylon preserve debts, marriages, disputes, hymn-like prayers, meticulous astronomical observations. They are quiet, almost tedious in their daily details. They talk of barley and silver, of houses and canals, of eclipses and market rates. There are omens about the king's fate, procedural rules for scribal work, contracts for labour. How does this everyday murmur of ordinary human life fit with the vision of Babylon as a roaring furnace of immorality? Could it be that the label of sin was placed on the city not because of what its people were, but because of what they represented to others? Power fears rivals, and memory often serves the victor. When a new empire rises, the old capital becomes a warning story. In the first millennium BCE, when Cyrus the Great of Persia took Babylon, he portrayed himself in inscriptions as a liberator who restored proper worship in temples that previous kings had neglected. In the language of those texts, Babylon remains sacred, but some of its rulers are subtly diminished. Later in religious literature, the whole city hardens into a symbol of spiritual adultery and doomed pride. By the time the Book of Revelation names Babylon the Great as the mother of abominations, the city is already slipping from geography into allegory. Once a name becomes a metaphor, can its historical body ever be fully recovered? Modern travellers, walking among the low walls and scattered bricks under the Mesopotamian sun, might feel a faint dissonance. Where is the wild excess, the orgiastic decadence, the overwhelming sensuality that sermons and novels and films have promised? The evidence of luxury exists: imported goods, carved ivories, references to banquets and music. Yet these are found across many ancient cities. Why is Babylon singled out for special condemnation, for eternal association with lust and blasphemy? Was it simply because it conquered Jerusalem at a vulnerable time? Because it became the stage on which another people's trauma unfolded? There is another quieter possibility that lingers like incense around the edges of the story. Perhaps Babylon's layered symbolism made it uniquely useful as a canvas for later anxieties. A cosmopolitan city, a hub of trade and ideas, a place where many languages and gods coexisted. To those who longed for purity, uniformity, and clear boundaries, such a city would look like dangerous mixing, like spiritual contamination. The word Babylon then becomes shorthand for everything that threatens to blur the lines. Foreign women, strange rites, music from distant lands, thoughts that do not stay inside their assigned walls. If so, is the accusation of sin really about the city, or about the fear of mixing, of change? Yet even this reading does not exhaust the unease, because archaeology itself is not neutral. Excavations at Babylon took place under colonial eyes, in the age when European powers carved up the Middle East and carried its treasures back to their own museums. The story told about Babylon then was filtered through the same gaze that admired ruins and despised the living people around them. Later, new regimes would rebuild and reinterpret the site again, each projecting its own image onto the ancient bricks. When every era uses Babylon as a mirror for its fears and desires, where is the city itself? Somewhere under those layers of condemnation, appropriation, and scholarly reconstruction, obscure traces remain untidy. There are missing walls, unexplained demolitions, texts that seem to refer to rebuilding after mysterious destruction, mentions of floods and fires that cannot be neatly assigned to known events. There are gaps in the chain of astronomical observations, uncertain breaks in royal lists, rumours of uprisings that left almost no trace. Could some of Babylon's erasure be more than the slow decay of time? Might there have been moments when someone or something wanted parts of its memory deliberately dimmed, its complexity flattened into a single, convenient curse word. As the listener's eyelids grow heavier, the name Babylon floats between symbol and ruin, between accusation and absence. The sands keep their own counsel. The tablets wait silently in museum drawers. The reconstructed gate gazes down on visitors who whisper of decadence and doom. Yet beneath all that, the simple question remains unresolved, curling in the darkness like an unanswered prayer. If the city of sins has been judged so harshly, who will sit in judgment over those who told its story? There is a small discomfort that refuses to settle. If the city itself lies low and fragmented, why does its story still climb so insistently toward the sky? Why does Babylon keep returning, not as streets and houses, but as a towering shape in the mind, a structure that seems to poke at heaven and invite punishment? Perhaps it is because one image, more than any other, has fused with the name, not a gate, not a palace, but a tower whose top was supposed to reach the divine. Yet when archaeologists walk among the ruins, they do not find a single, obvious, intact tower that matches the story. There are foundations, mounds, broken platforms. There is talk of a great ziggurat called Etemenanke, the house of the foundation of heaven and earth. And still, something crucial is missing, as if the top of the story has been sheared off, its summit dissolved into legend. Ancient Mesopotamia loved stairways to the sky. Across the plains, from Ur to Uruk to Babylon, stepped towers rose above the flatness, great layered cakes of mud brick covered with fired brick and bitumen. They were temples, axes of connection between heaven, earth, and the underworld. The ziggurat at Ur is still partially visible, restored and squared. It is impressive, but finite. It does not feel like an act of transgressive arrogance so much as a solemn architectural prayer. So why did one particular tower, associated with Babylon, become the core of a story about hubris and divine retaliation, a story in which human beings are scattered, their tongues scrambled, their unity broken? The book of Genesis presents the tale in spare, suggestive strokes. A plain in Shinar, bricks baked thoroughly, a tower with its top in the heavens, a human desire to make a name and avoid being scattered. The deity descends, confounds their language, and disperses them over the face of the earth. There is no explicit mention of Babylon in the passage itself, yet later tradition firmly locates this event there, blending the myth of Babel into the memory of the actual city. Meanwhile, in cuneiform inscriptions, the great ziggurat of Babylon is praised as a sacred connection, not a blasphemous intrusion. An inscription of Nebuchadnezzar II describes his work on Etemenanke, recounting how previous kings had failed to complete it and how he undertook to rebuild it in obedience to the god Marduk. In that version, the tower is an act of piety, not rebellion. How did the same structure become both devotional ladder and sinful spear thrown at the sky? The ruins complicate the picture further. Archaeologists have identified a massive square foundation in Babylon that is widely accepted as the base of the ziggurat. Classical writers like Herodotus mention a temple tower with several stages and a shrine at the top. But those accounts come centuries after Babylon's peak, and Herodotus' description has its own puzzles and exaggerations. He speaks of a colossal structure, yet the precise measurements are debated, the details patched together from texts, fragments of brick, sketches from early explorers. The upper levels of Etemenanke, whatever they once were, have vanished almost completely. Only waterlogged pits and traces of brickwork imply their former height. One could stand at the site and see, not a tower challenging heaven, but a hollowed square, filled with mud and silence. How does a hollow become the symbol of overreaching height? In 1913, scholars reconstructed from ancient accicular tablets what seemed to be a description of the dimensions of the tower. The numbers implied a height roughly equal to its base, a perfect cube-like proportion that satisfied mathematical elegance more than narrative drama. Later debates questioned the interpretation of those measurements, the reliability of the tablets, the accuracy of their copying. Layers of scribal transmission intervened, like shifting veils. Did the original tower ever stand as tall as later imagination demanded, or did religious storytelling stretch its shadow upward to make the moral lesson more striking? There is another unease hidden in the language itself. The Hebrew wordplay between Babel and the verb to confuse has long been noticed. In Akkadian, however, the name Babilu can be taken to mean gate of the god, or gate of the gods. In one tradition, the city's name is about divine access. In another, it becomes a symbol of divine punishment through confusion. The same syllables, different etymologies, different fates. The tower, too, can be seen as either an offered stair for the gods to descend, or an arrogant ladder humans attempt to climb uninvited. How easily can a ritual of connection be rebranded as a crime, once the storytellers change? Why then did this particular myth of linguistic scattering adhere to Babylon so strongly? History tells of many towers and monumental projects across cultures, the Egyptian pyramids, the stepped pyramids of Mesoamerica, the mountain temples of other lands. Yet it is Babylon that carries the weight of the story, where unified human speech is shattered, where the dream of one language, one people, one project is judged dangerous. Could it be that, at some quiet level, the myth is less about bricks and more about discomfort with multiplicity itself? A large, multilingual, multi-ethnic city filled with traders and scribes could look to outsiders like a threat to simpler, homogeneous identities. To say their tongues were confused might be a way of turning lived diversity into an act of divine disapproval. The ziggurat itself, as far as the evidence shows, was not a gathering place for crowds at its summit. Its upper shrine would have been reserved for priestly rituals, for the resting of the god statue, for observances that were more cyclical than revolutionary. Babylonian texts speak of processions, offerings, festivals in which the gods travel between temples. The tower is part of a network, a choreography of sacred routes. Yet in the later narrative, it becomes an isolated monument to human pride. A solitary finger in the sky is easier to condemn than an entire web of relationships. Was this simplification accidental, or was it convenient for those who wish to compress a complex religious system into a single cautionary image? Modern scholars sometimes suggest that the story of Babel could echo collective memories of the breakdown of old cultural unities in Mesopotamia, or the shock of encountering empires where many languages coexisted. Others see in it a theological statement about the limits of human ambition, or a reflection of the trauma of exile and displacement. But all these interpretations occur thousands of years after the bricks were laid and eroded. The people who ordered the tower built, who carried baskets of clay up dusty ramps, are silent. Their intentions, fears, and hopes are held inside mute bricks or lost inscriptions. We are left with a triangle of traces: the physical foundation, the royal boasts of pious building, and the later religious myth of arrogant overreach. Which side of the triangle is closest to what once stood there? Even the destruction of the tower is a mystery folded inside other mysteries. Various texts mention rebuilding and repair. Some refer to earlier kings who began construction but did not finish, to foundations that had become waterlogged, to projects interrupted by disaster or neglect. Later, foreign rulers stripped bricks for their own uses or levelled structures in punitive campaigns. floods and shifting rivers undermined foundations. Was there a single moment when the tower fell in dramatic ruin, as the story might suggest, or was it instead slowly unravelled, dismantled, recycled, forgotten, until only the ghost of an outline remained? As the listener's breathing deepens, perhaps another question flickers gently at the edge of awareness. If a tower can be recast from sacred bridge to sinful spear, from gate of the gods to monument of confusion, what does that say about the solidity of other stories that rest on ruins and names? When language itself can be turned into an argument that something once holy was always already corrupt, how much of what is remembered as pride is simply the residue of someone else's need to warn, to control, to explain? In the darkness behind closed eyes, a shape begins to rise, step upon step of dimly seen platforms, climbing out of the plain, its top dissolving into low clouds. Around it, languages swirl like slow birds, circling, landing, flying off again. No one can say precisely how high it was, or what was whispered in the shrine at its summit, or whether the scandal lay in the building of the tower, or in the later decision to declare that heaven had rejected it. At the centre of the dream stands only a question, patient and deep. When a structure's body is gone and only its accusation survives, whose hands are really doing the building? Another unease begins to surface like a faint outline in the half-light. If the tower reaches too far upward in the stories, then something else in Babylon seems to dangle forever just out of reach. A wonder that is supposed to hang in the air, lush and impossible, yet refuses to solidify under the archaeologist's trowel. The Hanging Gardens of Babylon are recited as one of the ancient wonders, a terrace of green suspended above the desert, watered by hidden machinery, a palace of shade and perfume. But in the soil of Babylon itself, the traces of this marvel are strangely elusive. How does a wonder of the world manage to be everywhere in imagination, and almost nowhere in the ground? Ancient writers who never saw Babylon themselves loved to describe these gardens. Diodorus Siculus, drawing on earlier accounts, wrote of high stone terraces planted with trees, of deep-buried columns supporting layers of soil, of a clever system that brought water up from the Euphrates without visible wheels. Strabo and Quintus Curtius Rufus spoke in similar tones, weaving together admiration and second-hand knowledge. They told of a king, often identified as Nebuchadnezzar II, who supposedly built the gardens for a homesick queen from the mountains, so that she might feel again the cool slopes of her childhood in the flat, hot plains. A tender story, a technical marvel, a romantic motive. Yet each of these sources writes centuries after Babylon's prime, at a distance where memory and invention blur. Excavations at Babylon have uncovered palaces, courtyards, storage rooms, fortifications. They have traced the ceremonial processional way, the temples, the outlines of Etemenanki. But no definitive structure has forced everyone to agree. Here, exactly here, the Hanging Gardens stood. There are candidates, vaulted rooms, thick walls that might have borne great weight, channels that might have carried water. There are reconstructions that place the gardens near the royal palace, or beside the river, or integrated into the fortifications. None of them has silenced the doubts. For a wonder so celebrated, why is its architectural body so uncertain, its location shifting like a mirage whenever a scholar approaches? In the late 20th century, an alternative hypothesis gathered strength, almost like a quiet rebellion against long habit. The Assyriologist Stephanie Daly suggested that the gardens may never have been in Babylon at all, but in Nineveh, the Assyrian capital further to the north. She pointed to inscriptions of Sennacherib boasting of an ingenious water-raising device, to reliefs from Nineveh showing terraced, tree-covered structures, and to possible confusions in Greek sources between Babylon as a specific city and as a broader idea of Mesopotamian grandeur. If she is right, then for centuries people have been praising a wonder in the wrong city, draping Babylon in borrowed leaves and waters. How many other details of the so-called City of Sins might be second-hand fantasies stitched together from distant reports and theological needs? The more one looks at the evidence, the more ambiguous it becomes. The Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar too left many inscriptions cataloguing his building projects. Temples restored, walls strengthened, palaces renewed. They speak of stone and brick, of cedar wood and gold, of his devotion to Marduk. Yet, in the texts available so far, there is no clear, direct reference to a monumental terraced garden built for a Median queen. Silence is not proof of absence, of course. Not every project was inscribed. But the story we're given by later authors has a complete narrative arc, a foreign bride, a loving king, an architectural miracle. Is it not curious that this appealing tale rests so much on voices writing centuries later, in other languages, under the shadow of other empires? If the gardens did exist in Babylon, they would have demanded extraordinary engineering. Water to keep trees alive in high terraces must be lifted constantly from the river or from wells. Ancient Mesopotamians knew of devices like the shaduf, the counterweighted lever, and screw-like mechanisms have been associated perhaps too eagerly with later figures like Archimedes. The Greek accounts speak of hidden technology that pulled water upward in a continuous flow. Imagine then, in the heavy heat of a Babylonian afternoon, hearing the slow grind of some wooden apparatus within stone chambers, feeling cool humidity rising from green terraces above a city of dust. That sensory contrast alone would have made the gardens feel almost supernatural. Did such sounds once exist, echoing behind palace walls now collapsed into anonymous mounds? If, instead, the true terraces were in Nineveh, then Sennacherib's texts are reinterpreted. He boasts of making water flow over great distances, of turning his city into a kind of artificial mountain landscape. Reliefs from his palace show trees planted on steps, with streams trickling down, and inscriptions use language that could easily have inspired later Greek stories of hanging gardens. In this scenario, Babylon wears a crown that was forged on another head. The city becomes, once again, a convenient symbol, absorbing into its reputation every image that fits the idea of decadent, impossible luxury. But perhaps the more disturbing possibility is that our craving for wonders is itself part of the machinery of distortion. A city marked as sinful must, in the imagination of its accusers, excel not only in moral failure but also in seductive splendour. It needs jewels and perfumes, hidden palace pleasures, impossible gardens where foreign plants drip from high balconies while exiles weep in the streets below. The more exaggerated the sensuality, the more satisfying the narrative of eventual judgment. In that sense, the hanging gardens are not just a question of brick and water, they are an instrument, a stage set on which the drama of temptation and ruin can be played with maximal contrast. Archaeology, which might have offered a sobering counterbalance, is itself caught in the same current. Early excavators approached Mesopotamia through the lens of the Bible and classical texts, already primed to expect certain wonders and certain sins. Clay tablets and earthworks had to find their place within a story that pre-existed their discovery. Over time, the discipline has become more cautious, more critical, but the deep grooves of inherited expectation are not easily erased. When a buried arched room is found with traces of irrigation, is it a fragment of the fabled gardens, or simply a part of a large, sophisticated city's everyday infrastructure? How much of identification is evidence, and how much is the quiet pressure to make the ground agree with the books? The gardens, then, hover between locations, between stones and words, between Babylon and Nineveh, between the need for a wonder and the reluctance of the earth to confirm it. They are lush in art and literature, where painters cover canvases with drooping vines, statues, fountains, languid figures. They are lavish in tourist brochures and popular histories, where Babylon is nearly always illustrated with impossible terraces, even when the caption nervously admits that their existence is debated. In the soil, by contrast, there is no terrace demanding to be acknowledged, no inscription that firmly announces, "Here, for my queen, I hung a mountain in the air." Only scattered hints, ambiguous levels, eroded channels leading to nowhere. If a wonder can be assembled so convincingly from longing, misremembered reports, and ideological projection, what else in Babylon's story has been conjured more than recorded? Does the label City of Sins recruit every available rumour of excess and pleasure, fastening them to Babylon's name whether or not they truly belong? A missing garden becomes luxuriant proof. A faint trace of irrigation swells into terraces. A king's boast about waterworks is retrofitted into romantic generosity and architectural indulgence. At what point does fascination itself start to behave like a kind of lie, not invented from nothing, but swollen beyond recognition? As the listener's thoughts grow slower, their breathing more even, an image might drift into the inner darkness, a staircase of stone, each level planted with trees that sway in a warm night breeze, water murmuring somewhere unseen. Below, the city sleeps. Above, stars are half veiled by leaves. Perhaps this place once existed in Babylon. Perhaps it rose in Nineveh instead. Perhaps it only fully blooms in the human mind, where desire for paradise and suspicion of decadence intertwine like vines around the same supporting columns. In the end, when a wonder is both everywhere in story and nearly absent in the ground, one question remains suspended, like a droplet of water about to fall. When we gaze at the ruins, are we really searching for the lost gardens, or only for a reflection of the fantasies that have already taken root inside us? In the dim corridor between legend and inscription, a single figure keeps appearing, like a shadow cast by two different lights. The name Nebuchadnezzar too is carved thousands of times into Babylon's bricks, quietly declaring, "I built, I restored, I made firm the foundations." In other texts, however, his name appears as an emblem of pride and punishment, a king who drags a holy city into exile, and later wanders mad among the beasts. To stand between these two portraits is to feel a strange dislocation, as if the same man has been split in half for the purposes of two incompatible stories. Which one, if either, belongs to the actual human that once breathed beneath the Mesopotamian sun? Under his rule in the 6th century BCE, Babylon reached a height of power and splendour that impressed even its enemies. Archaeology shows that the city's great walls, the processional way, the temples, and the vast palace complexes bear his imprint. Bricks stamped with his name form a steady, repetitive heartbeat in the ruins. In his own inscriptions, he presents himself as the careful servant of Marduk, restorer of ancient cults, repairer of dilapidated sanctuaries. There is a tone of continuity, of reverence toward the past, a king claiming legitimacy by stitching himself into a long line of rulers. The language is ritualized, formulaic, almost monotonous. Yet the sheer scale of the building projects it describes is anything but modest. How does such a king become, in another tradition, the embodiment of monstrous arrogance? The Hebrew Bible tells a different story. In the books of Kings, Chronicles, Jeremiah, and especially Daniel, Nebuchadnezzar becomes the face of catastrophe. He lays siege to Jerusalem, destroys the temple, carries away sacred vessels, and drags a portion of its population into exile. In Daniel's narrative, he dreams of a colossal statue with a head of gold, chest of silver, legs of iron, feet of mixed clay. He erects a golden image and demands universal worship. He boasts from the roof of his palace, "Is not this great Babylon that I have built?" For this pride he is struck down by a divine decree, driven from human society, his mind altered until he eats grass like oxen, his hair growing long like eagle's feathers, his nails like birds' claws. It is a grotesque, haunting image, a powerful man reduced to animal-like abjection. Yet cuneiform records are silent on any such humiliation. Historians have long debated how much of this depiction reflects historical memory, how much theological interpretation, how much political necessity. Babylonian court records and administrative tablets show a functioning bureaucracy, a stable reign, and no obvious sign of a king who vanished into madness for years. The Babylonian chronicles mention his military campaigns, including those in the Levant, but say nothing about his inner torments. It is as if two archives, one written on clay and one on parchment, have agreed to disagree about who this man was, each preserving a version tailored to its own needs. When such divergence opens, which set of texts acquires authority in later memory, and why? Nebuchadnezzar's own words, such as those preserved on the East India House inscription and the Etemenanki tablets, emphasize pious motives and ritual correctness. He claims that previous kings had neglected and left unfinished the great ziggurat, and that he, chosen by Marduk, undertook its completion. He prays for the stability of his rule, the flourishing of his people. There is pride here, certainly, but it is couched in religious clichés, the standard self-praise of a Near Eastern monarch. Yet in the Book of Daniel, the same gesture of boasting becomes the trigger for divine judgment. Is it possible that an ordinary royal ideology, seen through the eyes of a conquered people, crystallized into a symbol of unforgivable hubris? The trauma of exile cannot be ignored. For those who saw their temple burned, their city walls breached, their elite classes displaced, Nebuchadnezzar was not an abstract figure of geopolitics, but the agent of personal and communal ruin. To encode that trauma into narrative required a face, a name. He became that focal point, the one who embodies imperial violence. Over time, as theological reflection deepened, his story was shaped into a drama of pride and chastisement, making him not only the destroyer of Jerusalem but also an example of what happens when human kings forget their limits before the divine. In this way, a specific historical disaster was elevated into a timeless moral tale. But in that elevation, how much of the actual king dissolved away? Some scholars have suggested that the madness episode may echo real experiences of Near Eastern rulers suffering from mental or physical breakdowns, filtered through a theological lens. Others see it as purely didactic, a crafted narrative meant to comfort the oppressed, with the assurance that even the mightiest can be brought low. Meanwhile, Babylonian scribes, loyal to their court and gods, had no interest in preserving any story that would undermine their king's image. They etched administrative efficiency and religious orthodoxy into clay. The conquered etched humiliation and cosmic justice into parchment. The result is a double portrait in which absence speaks as loudly as presence. There is also a quieter pattern in how later cultures remembered him. In some Jewish and Christian traditions, Nebuchadnezzar eventually softens a little, acknowledging the power of Israel's God after his bout of madness. In others, he remains a warning, a prefiguration of future tyrants. Medieval and early modern commentators sometimes conflated him with other foreign kings, or treated his reign as the beginning of a larger sequence of empires destined to fall. In Islamic traditions, his name appears in various stories, some portraying him as a scourge sent by God, others mixing him into different cycles of legend. With each retelling, the historical core becomes more indistinct, like a face glimpsed through layers of veils. When a single man's name is used to mark so many different anxieties, how much of him is left for himself? Back in the earth of Babylon, the bricks retain a different kind of memory. Repetitions of royal titles, epithets, brief boasts about finishing walls and restoring sanctuaries. Visitors to museums might see clay cylinders and foundation plaques, each inscribed with his name and achievements displayed under cold glass. Those artifacts speak in an impersonal, almost bureaucratic tone, far from the fevered drama of prophetic denunciations. There is a friction between the calm self-certainty of these royal texts and the burning outrage of the exilic literature. That friction is where history blurs into something unstable. Were the bricks lying, or were the prophets exaggerating? Or is the question itself too simple for a world where each side saw only the part of the man that pressed most painfully against their own existence? Modern scholarship, often wishing to be neutral, tries to separate political fact from theological overlay. It reconstructs campaigns, alliances, tribute networks, city plans. Yet the very decision about which sources to trust more heavily can tilt the balance. Emphasize the cuneiform, and Nebuchadnezzar becomes a standard imperial monarch, notable for his building projects and military success, but hardly unique in cruelty. Emphasize the biblical record, and he becomes a nearly archetypal villain, a necessary antagonist in the story of a people wrestling with divine judgment and hope. Is it possible that our era, valuing some forms of documentation over others, is only building yet another selective version of this endlessly rewritten king? Somewhere beneath these interpretive layers lies a real person. A child once carried in someone's arms, a young prince educated by scribes, a man who made decisions under pressure, who feared revolt, plague, and divine displeasure. He may have admired certain constellations, worried over omens, listened to advisors argue. None of that inner texture survives in any unmediated way. Instead, we have the enormous shadow of his empire and the deliberate distortions of those who loved or hated what he represented. When an individual life is turned into an emblem on such a scale, can we ever be sure that we are not merely tracing the outline of our own concerns upon his absent face? As sleep draws nearer, the figure of Nebuchadnezzar drifts at the edge of the listener's mind. In one hand, a brick stamped with his name, in the other, a spectral crown that keeps slipping into a crown of thorns, a beast's mane, a halo of prophetic fire. The bricks lie stone still, the texts continue to argue across millennia. Between them, a human being has been stretched into symbol until the original contours vanish. In such a silence, one last question curls softly through. The dark. When a ruler is remembered less for what he did than for what others needed him to mean, does his true story die with his body? Or does it remain, faint and unclaimed, somewhere behind the two opposing masks? From the fractured figure of a king, another unease slowly spreads outward, like a hairline crack in fired clay. If Nebuchadnezzar can be split into two incompatible versions, what about the countless smaller lives that never became symbols at all? Their names were not preserved in holy books or in royal boasts. They flicker only in the faint strokes of wedge-shaped marks pressed into damp tablets. In dark storage rooms of museums, in drawers and shelves far from the old riverbeds, lie hundreds of thousands of cuneiform tablets, many unread, many half-broken. They are the closest thing we have to Babylon's own voice. Yet even here, something feels filtered. When the city speaks to us through clay, who chose which words would be heard and which would stay asleep? Babylon's scribes were among the most meticulous recorders in human history. They noted the rising and setting of planets, the dates of eclipses, the price of barley, the names of witnesses to a loan. On some tablets, long lists of omens unfurl. If a certain cloud forms, if a sheep's liver has this mark, if Mars stands in a particular constellation. On others, legal contracts record marriages, adoptions, property transfers. There are hymns to the gods, laments for destroyed cities, school exercises where a student's shaky hand copies old phrases. The everydayness of it all might surprise anyone expecting a city of orgies and unrestrained vice. The clay undercuts the thunder of later condemnation not by argument, but by calm repetition of human details. Among the most haunting of these documents are the astronomical diaries. Year after year, anonymous scribes noted celestial events and earthly matters side by side. Month X, day Y, lunar eclipse. That month, barley was so much per shekel. The king stayed in the city. The river level rose. Over centuries, these records allowed Babylonian scholars to predict eclipses, to track the irregular motion of planets, to derive mathematical schemes that modern historians of science still marvel at. From the so-called mull-up-in compendium to complex ephemerides, a quiet, relentless attention to the sky permeates their work. The same civilization later accused of wallowing in sensual excess spent its nights measuring starlight with patient abstraction. How easily can accusations of decadence erase such disciplined watchfulness? Yet the tablets are not democratic windows into every Babylonian life. They were produced by literate elites, by households with wealth, by temples and palaces. The poor, the enslaved, the voiceless appear mostly as objects in transactions, their own inner worlds never directly recorded. Even the scribes' observations follow certain rules, certain priorities. They recorded what their institutions valued, omens relevant to kings, accounts relevant to revenue, rituals relevant to cults. What about private doubts, quiet rebellions, whispered criticisms of rulers or gods? A few rare texts hint at skepticism, at laments over injustice, but the overwhelming bulk of the archive flows within the channels defined by power. When we say, Babylon speaks, are we only ever hearing those who are allowed to carve their words into clay? The process of decipherment adds another layer of selection. In the 19th century, when scholars in Europe and elsewhere first began to unlock cuneiform, they gravitated toward royal inscriptions and spectacular discoveries. Kings, conquests, and monumental building projects attracted attention. Dusty loan contracts did not. Biblical connections were prized. Mundane documents in obscure dialects languished. Over time, as Assyriology matured, more varied texts were studied, but the habit of privileging certain genres persisted. Even now, countless tablets remain untranslated, sitting in museum basements, while a smaller, more interesting subset keeps being cited, anthologized, taught. The archive that reaches the public imagination is a fraction of the archive that exists, which is itself a fraction of what was ever written, which is itself a fraction of what was ever thought and lived. Some kinds of tablets are especially susceptible to being framed as evidence of sin or superstition. Collections of erotic incantations, rituals to attract love or curse rivals, lists of offerings to deities linked with sex or wine. These can be highlighted to support stories of Babylon as a place of unbridled desire. But they are part of a much larger ecosystem of ritual and law, woven into everyday concerns about fertility, health, and survival. When later polemicists spoke of Babylon's fornications, did they know or care that similar incantations and rites existed in many cultures, including their own? Or did the city's name function as a container into which all imagined excess could be poured, while the sober arithmetic of grain rations and planetary periods quietly faded from view? On some tablets, there is a different kind of trembling. The city laments, though not all originally Babylonian, echo through Mesopotamian literature. Poems mourning fallen temples, burned gates, the loss of divine favour. Fragments of laments associated with Babylon itself, or with its gods, suggest that its inhabitants too knew what it meant to experience destruction as a kind of cosmic wound. Lines speak of streets emptied, of bells silenced, of processions halted. Such texts invert the later image of Babylon as the triumphant persecutor. Here, the city appears as victim, abandoned and broken. How often are those voices allowed to shape the stereotype of the city of sins? When a place alternates between oppressor and oppressed, do we choose the role that best serves the story we want to tell? There is also something unsettling in the technical coldness of many astronomical and mathematical tablets. They contain sequences of computed values, step-by-step procedures, symbols that anticipate ideas of functions and series. Between these wedges, there is no explicit mention of lust, idolatry, or moral outrage. Instead, there is a quiet confidence that the heavens follow patterns that, though complex, can be grasped and predicted. To call such a culture simply degenerate seems almost like willful blindness. Could it be that part of the hostility toward Babylon in later religious texts reflects not only political enmity, but also discomfort with a sophisticated alternative cosmology that did not fit neatly within emerging theological frameworks? And yet, the tablets can also be read as tools of control. Omens were consulted to justify or forbid military campaigns, to sanction royal decisions, to manage fear. Contracts and decrees locked people into obligations, recorded debts that could haunt families for generations. The same scribes who charted Venus might also tally slaves, taxes, and penalties. Perhaps it is too simple to set the cuneiform archive against the stereotype of sin, as if clay were innocent and metaphor guilty. Power and anxiety, curiosity and domination twine through these documents like intertwined reeds pressed into mud. The question is not whether Babylon was really sinful or really scientific, but who gets to decide which aspects become its eternal emblem? Modern editors, anthologists and translators play an invisible but decisive role. A published collection of Babylonian wisdom literature might shape the city as philosophical and introspective. A selection of Babylonian magic and sorcery can just as easily emphasize fear and manipulation. Each title, each syllabus, each exhibit panel assembles a new Babylon from the shards of the old. Meanwhile, the bulk of the tablets, still unread, wait in trays and boxes, their wedges crumbling slowly with time. In that quiet degradation, another kind of loss is taking place. Not the deliberate demonization of a city, but the gradual erasure of subtleties no one has yet had time, funding, or inclination to rescue. As the listener drifts closer to sleep, perhaps an image forms. A dark storeroom, rows of shelves, and on each shelf stacks of small clay tablets, some whole, some broken. No sermons echo here, no proclamations of abomination or glory, only the soft, patient presence of matter impressed by vanished hands. Somewhere among these fragments may lie a line of poetry that would reframe our sense of Babylon, a legal clause that reveals unexpected mercy, an observation of the sky that hints at a different way of mapping reality. They exist, but remain unread, unseen, unquoted in the loud stories that call the city cursed. In this half-light, a last question presses gently at the surface. If the true Babylon is buried not only under sand, but under millions of unvoiced lines in languages few now can read, then when we repeat that it was a city of sins, are we describing its past, or only the narrow, convenient slice of its memory that survived the choices of scribes, conquerors, curators, and scholars? And if so much of a civilization can be muted by such choices, quiet as wedges drying in forgotten boxes, what will be left of our own words when future hands sift through the rubble of our foundations? After the quiet murmur of tablets and the double faces of kings, another discomfort edges into view, like a crack that has been not only allowed to spread, but carefully widened. If Babylon's memory can be distorted in story, could its very body have been shaped by something more deliberate than simple decay? A city does not vanish overnight. Walls crumble slowly, bricks loosen, roofs fall in. Yet in Babylon's case, the gaps feel almost intentional, as if someone had walked through the centuries with a chisel and a torch, erasing not just buildings but particular meanings. How many times can a city be killed before its ruins begin to look like design? Long before Babylon became the symbol of sin for later traditions, it already stood in the crosshairs of rival empires. The Assyrian king Sennacherib, ruling from Nineveh in the late 8th and early 7th centuries BCE, left inscriptions that sound almost exultant in their description of what he did to Babylon after a revolt. He claims to have destroyed the city utterly, to have flooded it, carried away its gods, scattered its people. Some scholars read his account as typical royal exaggeration, but archaeological layers do show widespread destruction in this period, a burn layer and collapsed structures that line up with his campaigns. When a king boasts of raising a sacred city like a deluge, and the soil bears traces of fire and ruin, how much is hyperbole, and how much is a moment when power deliberately sets out to rewrite the map of the holy? Later, under Esarhaddon and Ashurbanipal, Babylon was rebuilt, its temples restored, its gods ceremonially returned. Already a pattern emerges: destruction followed by reconstruction, wrath followed by reconciliation. A city that can be smashed for rebellion and re-sanctified for utility becomes an object, a movable piece in imperial calculus. Its holiness is negotiable, its image reversible. Perhaps the deepest violence is not the burning itself, but the knowledge that the fire can be followed by gilding, that the same hand which tears down can later proclaim itself the healer. In such cycles, how much of Babylon's identity belongs to its inhabitants, and how much to the moods of the distant thrones that rise and fall around it? When Cyrus the Great of Persia entered Babylon in 539 BCE, his propaganda took a different tone. The famous Cyrus Cylinder presents him as chosen by Marduk to end misrule, to restore proper worship, to return displaced peoples to their homelands. Compared to Sennacherib's violent rhetoric, Cyrus's image is that of a restorer rather than a destroyer. Yet the effect on memory is equally strong. In his account, the previous Babylonian king becomes the villain, the one who angered the gods. Babylon survives as a city, but its recent past is recast as a failure that justified foreign intervention. Is this not another kind of controlled erasure, one that does not burn stones, but rearranges loyalty and blame? Later still, Greek sources hint at yet another wave of damage. Herodotus writes of walls and towers. Xerxes, after suppressing rebellions, is said by some later accounts to have punished Babylon harshly, perhaps tearing down parts of temples, removing statues, diminishing its privileges. The evidence here is more fragile, woven from indirect references and archaeological absence. Some scholars question whether Xerxes' destruction was as severe as once thought, But even uncertainty leaves a mark. The possibility of a targeted attack on Babylon's religious heart lingers like a bruise that cannot be clearly seen, only felt when the narrative is touched. Then comes Alexander the Great, entering Babylon in 331 BCE to the acclamations of priests and elites eager to secure favour. For a moment the city seems poised to become the capital of another vast empire. Alexander plans restorations, orders work on the great ziggurat, consults astronomers. Yet within a few years he is dead in Babylon itself, possibly of fever, possibly of other causes, his empire ready to fracture. Some ancient accounts mention the ziggurat being in disrepair when he arrived. Others note his orders to rebuild it. The work, however, stalls. By the time later visitors describe the site, the tower is largely gone. Was this slow failure simply the result of overambition and political chaos, or did the competing successors of Alexander have reasons to let the old religious centre dissolve into a quarry? For that is what Babylon gradually became, a convenient source of bricks. Sun-dried and fired bricks bearing old royal names were pried loose and reused in new constructions, fortresses, villages, canals. Over centuries, layers of the city were cannibalized by those who needed solid material more than they needed the integrity of the past. To quarry a temple for house walls, to dismantle a palace to build a dam, is not necessarily an act of conscious malice. It can be simple necessity. But when it happens again and again, across regimes and generations, the result is indistinguishable from a slow distributed decision that Babylon's form does not need to remain intact. At what point does necessity blend into an unconscious conspiracy of forgetting? Nature too played its ambiguous part. The Euphrates shifted course over time, undermining foundations, flooding lower quarters, leaving silt where streets once ran. Earthquakes shook the region. Seasonal rains eroded mud brick structures that were not regularly maintained. Without constant repair, even the grandest ziggurat slumps into a hill of compacted earth. Yet natural processes can be hastened or slowed by human choice. A canal left uncleaned, a levee unrepaired, a temple roof neglected. Each is a small decision that allows decay to advance. When a conqueror chooses not to fund repairs to a rival's holy places, is that not an indirect form of dismantling, more deniable, but just as effective? By the time Roman era, travellers looked upon Babylon's remains. They already spoke of ruins, of desolation. One text attributes to a foreign visitor the impression of a city so thoroughly destroyed that wild animals roamed among collapsed houses. Later, medieval Muslim geographers saw scattered mounds, occasional villages nestled among ancient bricks. Some associated the area with Quranic references to Babel and the teaching of forbidden knowledge. In each description, the physical shrinking of Babylon seems to invite ever more moral weight to be piled onto what is left. The smaller and more broken the city became, the larger its reputation as a warning grew. Is there not a strange symmetry between material diminishment and symbolic inflation? Modern times did not break the pattern, they twisted it into new shapes. In the 20th century, during and after World Wars, military activity and modern construction scarred the site. Trench lines, vehicle tracks, hasty earthworks intersected with ancient foundations. Later, under a modern regime, large-scale rebuilding began on top of the ruins, with new brick stamped, not with Nebuchadnezzar's name, but with a contemporary leader's. Portions of walls were raised in modern patterns approximating ancient outlines, palaces reconstructed with concrete and fresh brick, tourists invited to walk through a simulacrum of old Babylon. To some, this was a patriotic act of revival. To others, an intrusion, a politicized overlay that obscured the archaeological record. When a dictator dresses himself in the aura of a demonized city, adding fresh layers of myth and ideology, is he restoring Babylon, or enacting yet another transformation of its body to serve present power? Archaeologists have had to work within, around, and sometimes against these accumulations of damage and reconstruction. Trenches must thread through centuries of disturbance, sorting war rubble from ancient collapse, modern plaster from old gypsum. Reports speak of looted trenches, of bulldozed mounds, of artifacts disturbed by hurried building projects. Each such intervention is a new stroke in the long uneven erasure. The site becomes a palimpsest where intentional and unintentional wounds overlap until they are hard to distinguish. Was this city simply unlucky in its geography and politics, or did its status as a symbol make it a particularly attractive target for those who required a stage, whether for vengeance, liberation, or self-aggrandizing revival? There is a disturbing thought that lurks in this pattern. Perhaps what survives of Babylon is not random. Perhaps the very emptiness in certain places, the missing tops of towers, the pulled-out foundations, reflect choices about which aspects of the city were no longer useful to those in charge. Temples that legitimized an older ruling dynasty could be allowed to decay. Walls that no longer served strategic purposes could be cannibalized. Symbols that contradicted new religious narratives might be quietly neglected until they crumbled. When later moralizing texts pointed to those ruins as proof of divine judgment, they may have been gazing at a landscape already shaped by human selection, an erasure done in stages, then retroactively framed as a single, inevitable fall. As the listener's breath evens out, perhaps a mental picture unfurls, not one catastrophic explosion, but a long procession of figures walking through Babylon with torches, hammers, and scrolls. An Assyrian general, a Persian administrator, a Macedonian officer, a Parthian merchant, an Abbasid brickmaker, a European excavator, a modern engineer. Each takes something, leaves something, rearranges the bones of the city a little more. By the time we arrive looking for the city of sins, we're wandering through a space curated by all of them. In the muffled darkness behind closed eyes, a final question rises like dust in a shaft of light. When a place has been destroyed, rebuilt, quarried, neglected and staged so many times, how can anyone still speak of its fate as a single, clear example of judgment, and not as a long, quiet, contested work of human hands upon another's memory? As the outline of ruined walls fades into the darkness, another pattern begins to glow faintly, less in brick than in ink and breath. If armies and floods could reshape Babylon's body, then sermons and visions have reshaped its soul for far longer. Long after the city had ceased to command armies, its name marched onward through religious texts as a code word for everything hateful and forbidden. Babylon stopped being a point on a map and became a spell, repeated in liturgies, hymns, and accusations. When a name is used this way for centuries, can it still belong to the city that once stood on the banks of the Euphrates, or has it been taken hostage by the needs of those who utter it? In the Book of Revelation, written in the charged atmosphere of the late 1st century CE, the figure appears fully formed. Mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots, and of the abominations of the earth. A woman seated on a scarlet beast, clothed in purple and scarlet, adorned with gold and precious stones, holding in her hand a golden cup full of abominations. She is drunk, not with wine, but with the blood of saints and martyrs. Here, Babylon is almost certainly a coded reference to Rome, the empire that ruled over the early Christian communities and in some cases persecuted them. Yet the author does not say Rome. The name chosen is Babylon, already worn smooth by centuries of association with exile and arrogance. how quietly a real ruined city is repurposed as a convenient mask for a new enemy. This transfer was not accidental. For the communities shaped by the Hebrew Bible, Babylon already meant destruction of the temple, captivity, humiliation. To call Rome Babylon was to import all that emotional charge into a fresh conflict, to tell believers that the empire crushing them was just another turn of the same wheel. The ancient city, long subdued and largely empty, provided a ready-made symbol of oppressive power, decadent luxury, and destined judgment. No one in those assemblies needed a map to Iraq. They needed a language in which to name the weight pressing on their own lungs. Babylon's old sins, real or imagined, became building blocks in a new structure of resistance and hope. But what happens to a place when its name is forever yoked to someone else's trauma? Over the following centuries, as Christianity spread and Rome itself converted, the symbol mutated but did not dissolve. Babylon became a flexible accusation, a label that could be pinned to whatever structure a given preacher or polemicist wished to condemn. In medieval Europe, critics of worldly wealth and corruption in the church could speak of Babylonian captivity, as if the institution that claimed to guard holiness had itself become the city of sin. Later, Protestant reformers would use the same language against the papacy, describing Rome as a new Babylon, a harlot seated on 7 hills. Each side at different times reached for the same word when it needed to brand an opponent as spiritually diseased. Babylon, unable to defend its own reputation, absorbed the blows like a ghostly punching bag. Yet the mechanism is older and wider than Christian history. Many religious traditions, when defining themselves, construct symbolic anti-cities, places that stand for chaos, idolatry, and moral breakdown. In the Hebrew Bible, Babylon fills that role at key moments. In other contexts, cities like Sodom, Gomorrah, or distant Nineveh take their turns. Islamic tradition, too, inherits and reshapes some of these images, with Babel and its tales of forbidden knowledge casting a shadow over certain places and practices. To say Babylon in a sermon in such worlds is rarely to talk about irrigation systems and grain storage. It is to evoke an entire emotional landscape, towers piercing heaven, drunken feasts, prostitutes in jewelled veils, idols shimmering in torchlight. How many of these images derive from actual archaeological realities, and how many from the subconscious vocabulary of fear? Propaganda works best when it can attach itself to something half-remembered and already frightening. For communities seeking purity and coherence, a sprawling, multi-ethnic, multi-religious metropolis like historical Babylon was an ideal negative mirror, a place where many gods were honoured, where foreign merchants and languages mixed, becomes, in the rhetoric of exclusivist faiths, a whirlpool that threatens to suck in true believers. To maintain boundaries, it is helpful to have a name that encapsulates everything across the line. Thus, Babylon evolves into a portable warning sign, planted wherever complexity, wealth, and difference feel overwhelming. But if that is so, is the hatred truly directed at the dusty, absent city, or at the messiness of human variety itself? Curiously, the same religious texts that curse Babylon often rely on its imagery to articulate their own longings. Revelation condemns her purple and scarlet, her pearls and gold, her music and merchants, yet it also grants her a kind of terrible allure. The narrative lingers over her adornments, her intoxication, her influence over kings. In condemning her, it cannot help but paint her vividly. Later preachers rail against the pleasures of Babylon, while unconsciously using that sumptuous language to give shape to desires they reject. The city of sins becomes a shadow theatre, where forbidden fascinations can be projected and attacked at once. Does this mean that part of Babylon's enduring magnetism lies not in its historical behaviour, but in the way it allows communities to flirt with what they fear. Comparisons with other demonized cities deepen the unease. Sodom and Gomorrah are remembered almost solely for their destruction, their smoke rising like the smoke of a furnace. Nineveh, capital of Assyria, is condemned by prophets as a bloody city full of lies. Yet none of these names has been as continuously reused as Babylon to label new targets. Medieval writers condemned Babylons of luxury and vice in their own towns. Modern commentators sometimes speak of financial centres or entertainment capitals as new Babylons, hardly thinking of Iraq at all. The word has become unmoored from its soil, a floating accusation ready to land wherever disapproval points. When a place's name becomes a generic insult, what chance does its complicated truth have of resurfacing? Even within religious scholarship, there's a tension between historical nuance and inherited metaphor. Some theologians and historians carefully reconstruct the real conditions of the Babylonian exile, noting that many deportees lived in settled communities, conducted business, and even thrived. They highlight texts like the letter of Jeremiah advising the exiles to build houses, plant gardens, seek the peace of the city where they dwell. This is not a portrait of an utterly depraved, inhuman hellscape, but of a foreign urban environment in which life, albeit wounded, continues. Yet popular preaching and devotional literature often skip directly from conquest to cosmic condemnation, smoothing over the messy middle ground where everyday interactions soften rigid boundaries. When teaching chooses the sharper image over the truer complexity, is that pedagogy or propaganda? Over time, the metaphor of Babylon seeped into political rhetoric beyond explicitly religious settings. Revolutionaries, moral reformers, and cultural critics borrowed the term to denounce capitalism, colonialism, decadence, or foreign domination. In some black diaspora traditions, Babylon named the oppressive systems of slavery and racism, turning the biblical symbol back against Western empires that claim those scriptures as their own. Here the word becomes a banner of resistance rather than submission, a way to expose hypocrisy. But even in this reversal, the original city remains a distant echo, its bricks and canals indistinguishable beneath layers of borrowed imagery. Can a symbol that has been wielded by both oppressors and oppressed still be traced back to its origin without tearing it apart? Sitting quietly beneath all this is a sobering possibility, that labelling a rival culture as a city of sins is not primarily a description of its behaviour, but a strategy of control. If a community can be convinced that all roads leading to a certain kind of cosmopolitanism, wealth, or religious plurality end in Babylon, then dissenters can be silenced by association. To question doctrine, to appreciate foreign customs, to engage with different philosophies, can all be painted as steps toward the harlot's cup. The name does not merely recall history, it polices the present. In such a climate, how many genuine curiosities, how many gestures of empathy or exchange, have withered under the fear of becoming Babylonian? Through all these centuries, the actual site of Babylon lay, mostly quiet, its bricks melting back into the earth, its lions and dragons sleeping under sand. Pilgrims, preachers, and prophets spoke of it more often than they visited it. They carried, in their texts and imaginations, a city that existed primarily as warning, its streets paved with the allegory rather than clay. When modern archaeologists finally unearthed more of its physical remains, they stepped into a symbolic minefield. Their reports, no matter how cautious, would inevitably be read by some through lenses polished by centuries of denunciation. Was every discovered wine jar a confirmation of debauchery? Was every temple a reinforcement of idolatry? Could a wall ever just be a wall again? As the listener's mind drifts toward the edge of sleep, the word Babylon itself may hover for a moment, emptied of pictures, just a sound from an ancient tongue. Once it meant the gate of the god. Later, it came to mean confusion, captivity, harlotry, oppression, empire, resistance. Each age carved another meaning into its syllables, like graffiti on an already weathered stone. Somewhere underneath those layers lies whatever the people of the city once meant when they named their home. In the darkness behind closed eyes, a quiet thought stirs. When a name has been used for so long as a weapon and a warning, is it still possible to hear, inside it, the small ordinary syllable of belonging that once meant simply, "Here we live"? Once a name has been sharpened for so long as an accusation, it begins to cast a strange backlight. The same word that terrifies the devout can lure the curious, like a warning sign that is also an invitation. If Babylon was turned into the ultimate emblem of corruption and forbidden splendour, it was perhaps inevitable that some would walk toward that emblem instead of away from it, drawn by the very force of the prohibition. In the centuries when theologians and preachers invoked Babylon as a symbol of decay, another, quieter current began to flow. Magicians, mystics, artists, and dreamers reached out to the same city as a reservoir of power and secret knowledge. What does it mean when the city of sins becomes at the same time a source of spells? During the Renaissance, as European scholars recovered Greek and Latin texts and peered beyond them into older traditions, the name Babylon slipped into the web of Prisca Theologia, the belief in an ancient, primordial wisdom behind all religions. Alongside Egypt, Chaldea, and the enigmatic East, Babylon was sometimes invoked as a cradle of astrology and magic. The Chaldeans, a term that originally referred to a people and a region, became in later usage almost a synonym for star diviners. Astrological handbooks spoke of Chaldean wisdom, and grimoires hinted that their techniques had roots in the practices of Babylonian priest astronomers gazing at the night sky. The very culture once condemned for worshipping false gods was recast, for a certain elite, as a keeper of keys to the heavens. Of course, much of this was projection. Renaissance magi did not have direct access to cuneiform tablets or reliable histories of Mesopotamian religion. They worked instead from classical references, biblical echoes, and their own imaginations. Babylon became part of an imagined East, a shimmering backdrop of pyramids, zodiacs, and mysterious rites. When a magician traced planetary sigils in a candlelit study, murmuring invocations in Latinized names and fragments of Hebrew, he might think of himself as inheriting something Chaldean, something from the old city by the Euphrates. Was he touching Babylon, or only the Babylon already filtered through Rome, Alexandria, and the fantasies of his own time? The ambiguity deepened in later centuries. As European empires expanded and Orientalism took shape, Babylon joined a gallery of exotic images: veiled women, incense-filled chambers, tyrant kings reclining amid dancers and musicians. Painters and writers used Babylon as a stage for scenes of luxury and bondage, where silks clung to bare skin and shadows flickered over carved lions. Even when they had only the faintest idea of actual Mesopotamian customs, they poured their own obsessions into the word. The city of sins became erotic not only in sermons, but on canvases and in novels. It was a place where one could imagine all the taboos being broken, safely distant in space and time. How far by then had this shimmering Babylon drifted from the smell of clay and river mud that once rose from its actual streets? Yet it was in the 19th and 20th centuries, paradoxically the same era when archaeology began to uncover genuine Babylonian artifacts, that occult and esoteric uses of the city's image multiplied. As scholars slowly pieced together cuneiform vocabulary lists and royal annals, popular culture and underground movements picked up the old name for very different purposes. Secret societies, ceremonial magicians, and fringe spiritual groups began to speak of Babylon and Chaldea as reservoirs of arcane power, as lost sources of ritual formulas and cosmic diagrams. They were not much concerned with precise philology. For them, Babylon's value lay in its charge, its long history as a forbidden, condemned, intoxicating place. In some strands of modern Western occultism, Babylon's shadow fused with another figure, a feminine, transgressive archetype who embodied both sexuality and spiritual rebellion, drawing loosely on the whore image in Revelation and mixing it with goddess motifs. Certain practitioners reinvented Babylon or similar spellings as a symbol of liberated desire, mystical intoxication, and destruction of oppressive order. What had been, in the biblical text, an image of ultimate corruption to be destroyed, became for them a banner of ecstatic revolt against hypocrisy and constraint. The harlot on the beast was no longer something to fear, but something to invoke, to embody in ritual. When a symbol can be flipped so radically, what happens to the historical city whose name lies buried beneath that transformation? Meanwhile, in spiritualist circles and popular esoteric literature, Babylonian and Chaldean systems of numerology, astrology, and magic were continually advertised, often with more marketing than scholarship. Manuals claimed to reveal ancient Chaldean secrets, linking number patterns, planetary spirits, and personal destiny. Even when the methods had little or no verifiable connection to ancient Mesopotamian practice, the invocation of Babylon added a patina of antiquity and danger. To say something came from Babylon was to suggest that it was both powerful and slightly forbidden, tapping into a well of energy that orthodox religions had denounced. Was this an unconscious continuation of the old demonization, or a strange tribute hidden beneath layers of misunderstanding? The eroticism attached to Babylon in these currents is particularly telling. In religious polemic, the city's sexual imagery serves as condemnation. In art and esotericism, the same imagery shifts toward fascination, even adoration. The harlot becomes muse. The decadent banquet becomes a fantasy of sensual liberation. The forbidden idols become symbols of alternative divinity. Those who felt cramped by the moral codes of their time could approach Babylon as a dream, space where desire and the sacred might intermingle without apology. Yet they could do so precisely because centuries of demonization had prepared the ground. Without the aura of scandal built by prophets and preachers, would the name have carried the same allure for seekers of transgression? At the same time, genuine Babylonian texts began to seep into esoteric circles in partial, distorted ways. Translations of creation myths like Enuma Elish, with their visions of cosmic battle and the ordering of chaos, were read alongside biblical Genesis as alternative cosmogonies. The figure of Ishtar, the goddess of love and war, descended into the underworld and returned, became a magnet for occult reinterpretation. She was seen by some as a forerunner of later goddesses, a piece of a shattered feminine divinity suppressed by patriarchal religions. In this reweaving, Babylon shifted from mother of abominations to lost mother of a more ancient, more fluid spirituality. How much of this reflects the concerns of modern readers rather than the cults of the first millennium BCE? There is another layer: conspiracy theories that absorb Babylon into sprawling narratives of secret control. In some apocalyptic subcultures, Babylon remains a code word for an alleged network of elites, bankers, occultists, or global institutions believed to manipulate world events. Ancient statues and ziggurat silhouettes appear on book covers, and videos that warn of a coming world order branded as Mystery Babylon. Here, archaeology's images are pressed back into the service of fear. The lions and dragons reconstructed from Babylon's gates become visual shorthand for an invisible empire of corruption. For the anxious, the ruins confirm that a dark pattern is repeating. For the city itself, long dead, it is yet another repurposing of its broken body as scenery in someone else's nightmare. In this tangle of attraction and dread, a peculiar symmetry emerges. Religious traditions demonize Babylon to guard boundaries. Occult and artistic movements approach the same figure to cross boundaries. Both rely on the same core image, a place of mixing, of many gods and languages, of pervasive luxury and potent rites. One side says, "Do not go there. It is death." The other whispers, "Precisely there is where forgotten life pulses." But neither, in most cases, has much to do with the daily texture of the ancient city. The scribes hunched over tablets, the traders haggling in the sun, the children splashing at the canal's edge. When symbols grow thick enough, do they completely smother the soil from which they rose? As the listener drifts deeper into quiet, the word Babylon may begin to feel less like a noun than a mirror. For some, it reflects lust and arrogance. For others, forbidden wisdom and liberation. For still others, a shadowy system of control. In dim inner vision, an image might appear, a half-ruined gate under a starless sky, part museum, part temple, part stage set. Around it, figures move in slow procession, a prophet with burning eyes, a Renaissance magician clutching celestial charts, a Victorian painter, a 20th century occultist, a conspiracy preacher with a microphone. Each stops before the gate, presses their own symbol onto its surface and moves on. The ancient bricks, real and imagined, grow ever more written over. Somewhere beneath all these layers, the actual city sleeps, its citizens long dust, its streets fused with the earth. Their gods' names are faint, their rituals mostly unrecoverable. They did not think of themselves as living in a city of sins or in a headquarters of esoteric power. They simply lived in Babylon. As the last thoughts soften, a question opens quietly, like a door into a dark garden. When every fear and desire of later ages has been projected onto a single ruined name, is there any path left by which the city itself can still be seen, or has Babylon become irreversibly only the sum of what others needed it to be? If a name can be turned into a symbol and a symbol into a spell, then the question returns, almost shyly, what of the earth itself? Long before late-night preachers and occult manifestos, the soil of Babylon had become a quiet archive. But in the last 2 centuries, even that archive has been handled by hands that were never neutral. Archaeology, at first blush, seems like the antidote to myth. Careful, methodical, grounded. Yet when shovels arrive under flags and funding from empires, can they avoid writing their own chapter in the long story of using Babylon as a mirror? In the 19th century, when European powers pushed deeper into the Ottoman domains, ancient Mesopotamia came into focus not only as a scholarly curiosity, but as a field of prestige. To possess the past was to possess a kind of soft power. Ruins became trophies, inscriptions became data points in narratives of Western progress. When Robert Coldaway and his German team began excavating Babylon at the end of that century, they did so with admirable technical care for their time, documenting bricks, foundations, streets. Yet behind their careful lines and notebooks stood an empire eager to plant its museums with spectacular objects, to demonstrate that German science could rival British and French spoils from Egypt and elsewhere. The past was being uncovered inside a present tense of competition. The Ishtar Gate is perhaps the clearest emblem of this double movement. Layer by layer, Coldaway's team exposed the glazed blue bricks, the striding lions, the Mushasu dragons. The gate, once part of a processional route where statues of gods passed amid incense and song, was lifted, crated, shipped up rivers and across seas. Reassembled in Berlin, it rose again, luminous under controlled lighting, its surfaces cleaned of centuries of dust. Visitors stand before it now in a European capital, awed by its scale and beauty. In a sense, something has been preserved from further decay, yet the gate's displacement is also a kind of second dismantling, uprooted from river air, local light, and the long-vanished city around it. It becomes easier to read as an isolated artwork than as part of a lived ritual landscape. Who, in that bright hall, decides what the gate means? Curatorial texts explain dates, dynasties, artistic techniques. They may mention that Babylon has been associated with biblical sin, perhaps gently correcting exaggerations. But the act of display itself speaks a quieter language, that this fragment of a condemned city now resides safely under Western guardianship. It is both an aesthetic object and, however unintentionally, a symbol of custody. If Babylon was once positioned as the opposite of God's chosen people, it is now positioned as an object of study for nations that long frame themselves as inheritors of biblical and classical traditions. Does this transition from demon to exhibit represent liberation from prejudice, or simply a new form of control, softer, subtler, lit by museum lamps? Elsewhere, other pieces of Babylon's fabric made similar journeys: bricks, reliefs, cylinder seals, tablets. In the process, the city's body was further fragmented, its parts scattered among London, Paris, Istanbul, New York, and private collections. Each fragment acquired labels, accession numbers, protective cases. The motives behind these removals were mixed: genuine desire to preserve, thirst for prestige, scientific curiosity, imperial entitlement. For the visitor in a distant land, such artifacts can awaken a respectful fascination, an awareness of histories otherwise ignored. Yet for the ground left behind, there is a hollowness, the sense that not only stories, but the very stones that once anchored them have been carried into other people's narratives. In the 20th century, as colonial rule receded and new states emerged in the Middle East, the ownership of the past became a more contested field. Iraq, as a modern nation, inherited Babylon's site as part of its territory and its identity. The ruins were no longer just a quarry or a scholar's playground. They became a national emblem, a potential source of pride and tourism. But when national identity is fragile and politics are harsh, the past can turn quickly into a stage for contemporary power. Under one regime especially, the resonance of Babylon proved too tempting to leave untouched. In the late 20th century, a strong man looked upon the mounds of Babylon and saw an opportunity. He ordered large-scale reconstruction. New bricks stamped with his own name rose atop ancient foundations. Walls were rebuilt along speculative lines. A palace was constructed commanding a view over the ruins. Tourists could be led along freshly laid bricks, told that they were walking where ancient processions had marched. The modern ruler cast himself as a new Nebuchadnezzar, the heir of a mighty Mesopotamian legacy, even as his own wars and policies added fresh layers of suffering to the land. For some citizens, these reconstructions stirred genuine pride in a deeper heritage. For many archaeologists, they represented a distortion, a theatrical set masking and damaging the fragile record beneath. The tension here is painful. How can a living society reclaim its past without collapsing nuance into propaganda, without burying what little remains under concrete reenactments? When reconstructed walls bear the name of a contemporary leader more prominently than that of ancient kings, the line between homage and appropriation blurs. Is the city being restored, or is its corpse being dressed to flatter the present? Then war arrived again. Military forces used the site and its surroundings for bases, storage, and operations. Heavy vehicles rolled over ancient pavements. Trenches bit into mounds. Sandbags were filled from archaeological layers. Satellite images and on-the-ground reports later revealed the scars, ruts, spoil heaps, disturbed stratigraphy. Some of this damage was incidental, the brutal practicality of conflict. Some, perhaps, was the result of ignorance or indifference. Either way, the accumulated effect was to add yet another chapter to Babylon's long history of being trampled by events that paid little heed to its own fragile story. In response, international organizations, archaeologists, and local authorities negotiated, documented, tried to repair what they could. Workshops were held, guidelines drafted, damage assessed. The language of preservation entered the same air once filled with royal boasts and prophetic threats. Yet even conservation efforts can carry traces of unequal power. Outside experts, often from wealthy countries whose museums house Babylonian treasures, offering guidance to a nation strained by sanctions and conflict. Is this solidarity, or another pattern in which the right to define and protect the past sits more securely in distant capitals than in the communities who live alongside the ruins? Archaeology under any regime, whether imperial, nationalist, or global, walks a narrow bridge. Funding must be secured, permits granted, political conditions navigated. Choices must be made, which layers to excavate, which periods to highlight, which narratives to emphasize when presenting findings to the public. In modern Iraq, with its complex tapestry of identities and traumas, the story of Babylon can never be completely separated from contemporary questions about who belongs, whose ancestors count, whose suffering is foregrounded. To call Babylon a heritage of humanity may sound inclusive, but it can also feel like a dilution, a way of abstracting local pain and pride into a generalized, almost ownerless past. Even within the discipline, scholars are not immune to the allure of certain themes. Works on Babylon that fit nicely into familiar Western frameworks, biblical connections, dramatic kings, spectacular architecture often find more publishers and readers than slow, patient studies of irrigation systems or neighborhood layouts. The excavation trenches are cut by trowels, but the intellectual trenches are cut by funding priorities, institutional interests, and the market for stories that resonate with enduring myths. How many research proposals have quietly bent themselves toward topics that echo the legendary Babylon, rather than the mundane realities of a Mesopotamian urban centre, simply because that is what audiences will recognize? Meanwhile, local voices not trained in Western academic traditions may offer other perspectives, dreams, folk tales, family stories about the mounds, religious associations with the land. Sometimes these are dismissed as superstition. Sometimes they are romanticized. Rarely are they integrated as full partners in the interpretation of the site. The result is another partial Babylon, one filtered through trowels and textbooks, another through sermons and songs, each only intermittently aware of the other. Can a city that has become such a global symbol ever truly be returned to those who live nearest its dust? Or is it now permanently suspended in a shared but asymmetrical space of imagination? As the listener's breathing slows, a scene might unfold in the inner dark. A stretch of baked earth under the Iraqi sun, mounds of brick, a reconstructed wall casting short shadows. Nearby, a line of tourists walks between painted lions. A soldier wipes sweat from his brow. A local child kicks a plastic ball that skitters against an ancient stone. Underground, untouched layers still hold traces of older streets and forgotten houses. In a distant city, The Ishtar Gate stands behind glass, cool and blue, as another group of visitors passes listening to an audio guide. Strings of interpretation connect these places, invisible and tense. Somewhere along those strings, questions hang like small, unsteady weights. When the story of Babylon is now told in classrooms, museums, documentaries, and policy meetings, whose version of the city is being quietly stabilized, and whose is left flickering at the edges? When the earth offers up a fragment of wall or tablet, who decides whether it becomes a national icon, a research specimen, a tourist backdrop, or a footnote? And if the City of Sins has at last been admitted into the halls of World Heritage, is that an act of contrition toward a long-maligned place, or only a new way of enclosing it in a frame we find comforting? Somewhere between museum glass and desert wind, another unease gathers, softer and more intimate. After towers and gardens, kings and prophets, spells and excavations, what remains is not just the puzzle of Babylon, but the thin, unsettling line between a city and the stories told about it. If Babylon has been judged, misread, recycled, and weaponized for so long, how sure can anyone be that their own city, their own age, will not meet the same fate when it too sinks into dust? The name Babylon once pointed to a very specific arrangement of water, brick, and breath, streets winding between houses of mud brick and baked brick, the smell of bitumen, of river reeds, of cooking fires, the weight of the hot sky pressing down on flat roofs where people slept, children learning to form wedge shapes on damp tablets, merchants counting sacks, priests watching the slow drift of Mars against a background of cold stars. All of this, taken together, formed a reality dense and continuous, too rich to be compressed into a single word like sin or wonder. Yet over time, as the bodies that felt that reality disappeared, what remained grew thinner and sharper, like a bone scraped clean. Babylon, city of sins, Babylon, mother of harlots, Babylon, mystery and code. Perhaps the most disquieting thought is that this thinning is not unique. Every city, every civilization is already being distilled, even while it still pulses with life. Certain images begin to crystallize, certain stories repeat more easily than others, certain crimes and virtues are highlighted while the rest blur into background noise. The people living inside those images rarely notice the process. To them, life is just life. Commutes, arguments, small joys, private shames. They do not think, we are now inscribing our epoch on the memory of the species. They think about deadlines, illnesses, love, boredom. The inscription happens anyway, in the choices of those who record and those who later select from what has been recorded. In Babylon's case, the selectors were priests, prophets, scribes, generals, chroniclers, emperors, monks, reformers, scholars, curators. Each held a fragment of the city's reflection, tilted at a particular angle. Some saw a rival to be cursed, some a trophy to be displayed, some a warning to be constantly refreshed, some a well of lost wisdom to be tapped. Rarely did anyone ask what it meant for the city itself to be pulled apart and rearranged like this. The dead do not protest when their name is turned into a synonym for everything someone else fears or desires. Yet if history is not an impartial river, but a series of canals dug by hands with intentions, then the label City of Sins reveals as much about the diggers as about the city. To call Babylon the archetype of vice is to decide that complexity must be simplified into a parable. It is to smooth over the contradictions, the devout inscriptions on the Ishtar Gate beside the lurid fantasies of harlotry, the precision of astronomical tables beside the image of drunken feasts, the laments of a conquered city beside the accusations of those it once conquered. A civilization capable of all these at once is reduced to a single sharp edge. How often, quietly, do we do the same to our own enemies, our own strangers, the places we have never walked? There is a darker possibility too, one that coils like a shadow beneath the rest. Perhaps the erasure of nuance is not merely a side effect of forgetfulness, but a function of power itself. Stories that comfort or motivate are easier to maintain when they have clean lines and unmistakable villains. A world in which Babylon is both oppressor and oppressed, scientific and superstitious, devout and indulgent, would be harder to use as a warning. So the edges are sanded, the paradox is blurred, the city pinned to a particular word, sin. The same impulse, scaled down, plays out whenever a neighbourhood, a nation, a religion or a class is reduced to a slogan. It is more convenient to say, they are Babylon, than to admit, they are as divided and unfinished as we are. Modern archaeology and critical scholarship have tried in their way to restore some of the lost depth. They have shown that exile in Babylon was not unending nightmare, that temples and observatories coexisted with markets and homes, that the city's reputation as utterly depraved is constructed rather than observed. Yet even these corrective efforts operate within limits. Funding cycles, publication trends, institutional biases. There is only so much attention to go around, only so many words that can be written and read. Against the roaring simplicity of Babylon the whore, the patient details of loan contracts and canal maintenance can feel faint, easily ignored. It is one thing to know intellectually that the caricature is wrong. It is another to feel the caricature losing its grip in the wider imagination. If this is how a city is remembered when it has lain quiet for millennia, what chance does any present tense have of escaping similar compression? Imagine some far future in which our own skyscrapers and highways have collapsed, our screens long dark, a fragment of a tower, a few data stores miraculously preserved, perhaps a scattering of printed pages in a language only partly understood. Future scholars, or whatever passes for scholars then, sift through these remains. They find images of opulence and poverty, of war and activism, of streaming entertainments and surveillance systems. They note quickly rising atmospheric carbon, plastic strata in the soil, mass extinctions. How easily might they speak of the age of excess, the fossil-fueled empire, the civilization of distraction, as if all human lives in this epoch fit those labels? They may fix upon one city as the emblem, a financial hub, a coastal metropolis now half submerged, a capital of entertainment or data. That name, like Babylon's, might be repeated in their texts as the shorthand for systemic sin. Remember the fall of X, they might say, invoking it in sermons or philosophical treatises, half as warning, half as myth. The people who once lived in that city, with their unrecorded kindnesses and small acts of courage, will have no more power to object than the Babylonians do now. Their voices will survive only where chance and selection have allowed them to. If that thought bites a little, it may be because it strips away the comfortable sense that we stand outside of history, looking down into it. We're inside it, as the Babylonians were inside their own unfolding days. They surely had no idea that their city would one day become the negative space around which later civilizations traced their fears. We, equally, cannot know which parts of our reality will be amplified, which erased, which recast as allegory, which turned into accusation. Perhaps already, in half-remembered headlines and casually repeated stereotypes, the future's Babylons of our age are being chosen. What, then, does the story of Babylon finally offer, if not a moral simplification? Maybe it is a kind of mirror in which the listener can see the mechanics of forgetting and framing at work. A reminder that the verdicts pronounced in sacred texts and popular culture, in museum labels and political speeches, are rarely the last word and never the whole. That behind every slogan, city of sin, axis of evil, hive of scum and villainy, there were kitchens and lullabies, mathematical problems and private griefs, sincere prayers and acts of tenderness that left no grand inscription. As sleep draws close, another image might emerge, one that does not belong solely to Babylon or to us. A river moving through the dark, its surface catching distant light. On one bank, half-buried walls and mounds, on the other, glass towers or their broken remnants. The water carries silt from both, grinding bricks and concrete into the same fine dust. Names whispered along its course change over time, gaining meanings, shedding them, becoming accusations, becoming aspirations, becoming little more than sounds. Once, people on the shore called this stretch Babylon. Later, they called it something else. The river does not answer. It only remembers in particles. Somewhere at the back of the mind, just before drifting under, a question lingers, thin and insistent. When future voices stand over our own ruins and choose a single word to sum us up, will they notice the ways we have already done this to others? Or will they simply repeat the pattern, certain that this time, finally, the story is true?